Our series in September has been the key ingredients of discipleship and neighboring. We've covered the key ingredients of abundance and relationship, and today we focus on the key ingredient of joy. One of the interesting things that my friends who work in the neighboring movement have discovered is that one of the key essentials for helping people overcome loneliness and engage in good neighboring is to find reasons to rejoice together, to find ways to engage in acts of celebration and joy with one another. And maybe you understand, in fact, how lonely it can be when you have cause for joy and no one to share it with. I was listening this week as I was doing some driving. I made a quick trip down to Wichita to help my sisters with my parents for about 24 hours. And whenever I'm driving, I listen to podcasts because they do a better job keeping me awake than music. And I love to listen to the Hamilcast that kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of what goes on behind the scenes of the whole Hamilton, not just the Broadway production, but their touring shows and all of that, how the whole thing works. And so they had a young lady on the podcast who is an understudy on Broadway. She is an understudy for the three Schuyler sisters. She can go in on a few hours' notice as either Eliza or Peggy or Angelica. But she was talking about the day she got the call that she had been cast as this understudy, and that she had come to have a sort of running joke with some of her friends that it seemed like whenever she had a big moment in her career, no one in her phone book answered their phones. And so the day she learned from her agent that she was going on into the cast of Hamilton on Broadway, she was understandably beyond excited. And nobody she called picked up their phone. And she would describe that feeling of just feeling like she was gonna burst, not having somebody to share it with. And on the flip side of that, nothing brings a greater sense of belonging than to find the people who understand your joys. During the 9:30 hour, we went around and were sharing one thing that was new and good. And I wondered how many of those folks had overheard the last part of my sermon at 8:30, because some of the examples that I had given in that sermon came up as we went around the circle of what it is when you have that moment where somebody understands what a joy it is to get several hours of continuous sleep strung together when you have a baby in the house, of what it is when you find an appropriate caregiver for a loved one that you're taking care of what it is to celebrate when you hit major milestones that just not just anybody might understand. There's this sense of belonging that is forged. But in discipleship too, sometimes discipleship becomes code for all the rules and the obligations of a life with God. But discipleship is not complete if it is made up of rules and obligations only. Jesus tells stories that prove this. In Matthew, there's one about a number of stewards who are given money. And the way that they respond to that gift reflects their understanding of God. So too, the parable that we have today. It's actually hard to jump into this parable on its own because it's actually the third in a trilogy of parables. These parables are told because there's grumbling about the people that Jesus is hanging out with. Jesus has this habit of eating with, of staying with, of hanging out with people whose reputations are terrible. And the Pharisees are concerned and they're dismayed and they're grumpy and they're fretting and they're worried about how Jesus is making all of them look, because he keeps being seen coming out of these people's houses, and he keeps being seen going to dinner parties with them, and he keeps being seen walking around the marketplace with these people. And so Jesus tells 3 stories. And in the first story, he says, but wait, who of you, if you have 100 sheep and one of them goes missing, wouldn't leave the 99 and go searching for the one, and then when you find it, lift it onto your shoulders and carry it back to the flock, and then when your shift in the fields is over, which one of you wouldn't go home and celebrate and tell all your friends how you had this little lamb and it ran off and you thought it was lost, but then you found it and it was safe and returned? And then he tells a story of a woman who has 10 coins and finds one of them is missing. And so she does what we do when things that are important are missing. She begins to look for it. And when the sort of obvious searching that she does doesn't turn it up, then she begins the sort of deep cleaning. You know, the kind where the pile of papers that you've been putting off for a couple of months finally gets sorted through, and then you start moving furniture and dusting in case it fell behind a thing. She even lights a lamp. In the middle of daylight, she lights a lamp to get a little extra light, in case it might catch that glimpse of the metal of the coin. And she doesn't stop searching until the coin is found. And then, when the coin is found, she gathers her whole neighborhood, all of her neighbors, and she throws a party to celebrate the finding of this one coin. It's a celebration. And Jesus tells the Pharisees, do you understand how much rejoicing there is in heaven over just one sinner who returns to relationship with God? And then Jesus tells this story. Jesus tells this story about the young man who decides to take his inheritance and leave to go make his way in the world. It doesn't sound a whole lot like there was much of a plan when he takes off, but off he goes. And as often happens, he finds himself pretty quickly out of resources, having spent them all, having a good time, being impulsive. And suddenly hard times fall on the nation that he's visiting. And all of the friends that he's been partying with and celebrating with and spending his money with have disappeared. And he's left hungry. And so he takes a job. And he doesn't just take any job. I need you to understand how much he's already had to swallow his pride to accept a job feeding pigs. This is a good Jewish boy who has been taught since his very youngest years that everything about pigs is unclean, and that in undertaking the act of feeding them, he too will become unclean. But it's the only job there is to be had. And so he is feeding the pigs one day, and he catches himself feeling jealous of the stuff he's feeding them, wishing he could fill his belly. And he has this aha moment. The light bulb comes on, and he thinks, this is nuts. Never in my whole life have I seen my father allow a single one of his servants to starve. I could go back. I could go back, not as a son, but as a servant. Because I know I've screwed up. I know that I messed up, and I know that I have damaged that relationship, and I know I can't go back as a son, but I could go back as a servant. And I know my dad. I know he would never let me be so hungry that I thought the pig's food looked good. And so he swallows his pride, and he heads back home. Now, I hope that all of you have had an experience of going home where you know what I'm talking about when I say there's that point where the landscape becomes familiar and your stomach sort of fills with a mix of butterflies and deep comfort. For me growing up, it was not where I lived with my parents, but it was where my grandparents lived in Papillion, Nebraska. And we would race to see who could see the Papillion water tower first, because that meant you were almost there. Whatever his familiar landmarks were that told him he was almost home, about the time he gets to that point, something unexpected is on the horizon. There's a figure running towards him. And as he draws closer and the figure draws closer, he soon realizes that figure is his father. And his father runs to him with open arms and embraces him, and he begins the speech that he's practiced all the way home, from that first aha moment in the pig pen, all the way back home. He's been practicing, Father, I know that I have sinned against you and against God, and I'm not worthy to be your son, but if you'll just let me stay and work. And he can't even get all the way through it, because his father picks him up off the ground and calls for a servant to bring him a robe, not a servant's outfit, not a cloak for working in the fields, but a robe befitting one who belongs in the master's house. And to bring a ring. You guys, that's like issuing him a copy of the family credit card. And sandals for his feet. And asks that a fatted calf be killed for a celebration. The fatted calf is a big deal. You don't have a fatted calf just for a Sunday dinner because the family's all home together. The fatted calf is what you offer when it's time for a wedding feast. The fatted calf is what you have when you intend to gather together everyone that you can find from the neighborhood and the town to come together. The fatted calf is going to last for days. He's getting ready to throw an epic party. He is ready to celebrate. So the celebrations begin. Servants go out into town to announce the good news that the one who was lost has come home and the master's throwing a party. Perhaps folks bring their instruments and begin to play some music. Soon the air is filled with the smell of the barbecuing fatted calf. But there's another son. And this is how I have come to believe that Jesus tells this story not primarily for the good of the sinners with whom he so regularly ate, but as an invitation to the grumbling Pharisees. Because I believe that if it had only been for the benefit of the sinners with whom he so often ate, the story would have ended there with the invitation to the party. But instead we find out that there was an older brother, one who'd been working in the field as he did day in and day out, because, first children things, responsible, straight A getting, follow the rules kind of first children. And there he had been in the fields doing the work that needed to be done to keep his father's land running and profitable. And as he returns home, things are amiss. Servants aren't working where they would be expected to be working. The air is filled with the smell of the fatted calf. There's perhaps music and neighbors gathering. And so he calls to one of the servants and he says, "Tell me what's happening." And the servant tells him, "Oh, great news, your dad's throwing a party because your brother came home." Except for the eldest son doesn't feel like it's great news. He's not filled with immense joy, but instead with the sort of simmering of resentment and jealousy. that eats at him. And it eats at him so strongly that he decides he's not going to go into the party. He's not ready to celebrate his brother's return. It's hard to blame him too much. It would be hard to celebrate the one who takes half of your father's hard-earned lifetime investment, blows it far away where your mom and dad sit at home and you hear your mom crying at night as she goes to bed, and you see your dad fretting every time he passes the spot where your brother would sit at the dining room table. And then he comes home and there's a party? And he can't bring himself to celebrate. But the story also doesn't end there. Jesus doesn't tell this story just to make the Pharisees look bad, just to fill them with guilt, or to paint them as childish, tantrum-throwing toddlers. Because as Jesus tells the story, the Father also leaves the party to come and plead with this one. And he says to him, "Come and rejoice with us. Share in my joy." The oldest son says, "This son of yours," you know how that goes. We always say it's not good in our house if we start any sentence with, "Do you want to know what your son did?" This son of yours took half of everything you earned and blew it in another country. And now he comes back and you killed a fatted calf for him when I have been here day in and day out, sweating over the finances, working in the field, managing your servants, figuring out when to sell and buy cattle, figuring out when the crops need to go into the ground, making sure that this place could be profitable to support you and mom day in and day out. And you've never even offered me a goat to throw a party with my friends. And the Father is filled with compassion. And he says, my son, you're always with me, and everything I have already belongs to you. But this one, this brother of yours, he was dead and now he's alive. He was gone and now he's here. We have to celebrate. And that's where Jesus ends the story, with an invitation to those of us who maybe find ourselves more closely aligned with the responsible older brother who carries the weight than with the impulsive younger one who runs away. With an invitation to us not only to live a life of obligation, of have to, of responsibility, but also to join in the joy. To remember that God invites us into the rejoicing of the kingdom of heaven every single time any one of us is restored into right relationship, to become a part of the party. And in doing so, to ourselves be restored again into the kind of relationship where we remember God's generous nature, God's great love that will come out of the party and plead with us, God's merciful love that when we say, "This son of yours," turns our head and says, "No, remember? This sibling of yours was gone and has returned. Come and join the party." I can think of no greater news than to know that the same God who will wait at the edge of the road and run with open arms to those who have strayed far away is also ready to call those of us who might get lost in the obligations and the diligence and the responsibility to return to right relationship filled with joy. Thanks be to God. Amen.